Today's lecture is going to be JavaScript and dynamic pages. So I know you all have begun your Codecademy lessons on JavaScript. What I want to do with this lecture is take some of those lessons and create practical applications. And we'll be using my own GitHub, the WRosh GitHub. And of course, you all should have that shared with you. If you have any trouble, definitely let me know and I'll help you so that you can get access to that code base. I don't mind at all. You know, with coding, I know with writing papers, people always talk about plagiarism and all of that. With coding, it's not really that as big of a deal. People copy different lines of code all the time. Now, if you start the next Facebook and you steal a bunch of code from Facebook, they'll probably sue you. But for academic purposes, it's not really that big of a deal because honestly, copying my code and trying to put it into your code, that's only half the battle anyway. Trying to make everything fit with what you've got built is a whole nother beast. So definitely don't feel bad about copying little snippets of what I've got on my GitHub. I want to do a little bit of a Git refresher. I think we had some great conversations during my office hours this past week. And so I want to capture some of that so that you all can have that fresh and ready. And for those of you who visited during office hours last week, can I get either a thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs sideways in terms of, do you have a much better idea of how that works? Okay, any sideways thumbs? Okay, I don't see any. So definitely come see me during office hours this week. It can definitely be helpful. I don't want you to have to spend a lot of time trying to figure out how Git works. I know that Git is definitely a pain to learn, but once you've got it down and you have it all set up on your computer, I think you'll come to appreciate the simplicity of it. It's just that setup that's hard. And now that you've got that, you've got something that's really translatable if you try to do your own projects even outside of this class. Popular question, how do I transfer code from my computer to GitHub? Well, there's two real methods. The method that I have on this slide is our command line. So the most important lines that you need to know are git pull. Anyone want to, well, I guess I have it here, but anyone want to say, just for volunteer points, what does git pull do? Why, or actually, how about this? When do I want to use git pull?
So you want to use your git pull if someone like on your team changes the code and you want to like transfer that code to locally into your computer, then you want to git pull that code into your computer so you can start making changes to it.
Great. Yeah, it's kind of the opposite of saving your document, but something that you want to do just as often as you would normally save your document, because you might not always have 100% visibility to what your teammates are doing. So you want to make sure that before you really get to working on a couple lines of code, that you have completely updated what you've got. I'll show you a little bit later what that looks like if you happen to forget to do git pull and how you can resolve that. So it's not the end of the world if you didn't git pull before you pushed a change through. There's just a couple extra steps you need to do to reconcile those changes. Git add. So when do you want to git add? And what does that do? Anyone? I know this is kind of a tough concept, so don't feel bad if you take a stab at it and you're wrong. I want to hear some stabs though, and see if we can get to that answer. Any volunteers?
I don't think I've used that one at all, so I don't really know. But I think Joanna put something in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let's see. So Joanne said, add the files that you just made edits to. And that's correct. So it's once you've made some edits and you're done doing that, you would git add that file in order to stage it. So the reason why git add is separate from the one below, git commit, is that you commit an entire set of changes, which might include several files. So each file, once you're ready to add that and transfer that over to GitHub, you would do git add that file, and then that helps you stage that so that now Git knows, okay, index.html, that's going to go into the next commit. So you might add 3, 4, a dozen, even more files in one batch. Does that make sense? Any clarity on that? Thumbs up, down, sideways? Okay, sounds good. Git commit. So what's this step? Why do I do this? Anyone?
Alana and I had a lot of trouble with GitHub, but I would kind of, the idea would probably be to be able to actually name the change that you're doing so that it's easy to be able to track it later.
Yeah, so that's half of it, is you're going to name the changes so that you can describe what that commit's going to look like. And so then on GitHub, your collaborators will see that you were, let's say, adding a nav bar to your page. And so you would write that into the Git commit. And then Git push, that's when you're actually pushing it onto GitHub. So that is the final step when you're going to try to transfer your code from your computer to GitHub. And the reason why Git add is separate from Git commit is Git add is adding individual files, whereas Git commit is now you're telling the system that you want to push all of these different files that you've staged as a single commit, right? So in order to, let's say, add a nav bar, you might be staging each HTML file for each different page that has the nav bar. Does that make sense? Okay. So a few tips. One is you want to make sure that you're on your command line, you're navigated to the folder of your code that you've cloned on your computer. And then if there are any errors, usually the error will actually tell you what you need to do. And if it doesn't, one trick that works 98% of the time is you just copy that error and then Google it. And then usually the top result is someone who is in the exact same situation as you. And remember that code or that website Stack Overflow that I showed you a lecture or two ago. That's a great sort of web forum that it's just got some really good coders that are there to help. So it's really helpful in that way. Usually you don't have to ask the question because someone's already asked the question for you, maybe years back, and their issue has been resolved. One example of a group that I spoke with during office hours is they were having a hard time pushing the commit, and the error actually said, you're not configured yet, you just have to add your username and email. And so they were able to add it this way, just using this line of code, which is pretty much what the error told them to do. And then after that point, it worked. Now, command line stuff can definitely be intimidating. And so I do want to go over a more graphical way that you can get this done. So here's an example with Visual Studio Code. So if you've downloaded this as your text editor, on the left, there's an icon, this 3 circles that are connected, and that's called source control. So when you click that, it actually shows you under changes which files you have changed. And when you click a given file, you can see on the left, it shows what the difference is between the original file that's on GitHub and your new file. So when you click on this, you can actually click this plus button, and that is the equivalent of the git add. So this is a way to stage your files without using any sort of command line. And then you can see here, I have previously added the index and nav.html. And so these are already in the staged changes category. When I want to commit, Now all I have to do is click the checkbox or the check button. And then when I do that, it's going to bring up a dialog that says, please describe your commit. You just type whatever the description is, enter, and then it's ready to push. In order to push, you just click these 3 horizontal dots, brings up this menu, and then you can click push. So this is a more graphical way to get it done. And if you have any questions, again, just let me know. I'm happy to stick around after lecture, Justin or Alana, if you all have questions with your specific application, and that goes for anyone else as well. And then of course, I'm available during office hours. If for any reason office hours does not work, just let me know. Maria, did you have a question?
Yeah, if I'm pushing and pulling with the GitHub desktop, that's equivalent to pressing those 3 dots, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's the same thing.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use Git. And I know a few of you have different ways of doing that downloaded to your computer. So I'm here to help you figure out what's the way that's best for you and the way that your computer is set up. All right, any questions about Git? One last thing, code conflicts. So sometimes you will either get an error when you try to do git push, or you might get this code conflict on GitHub that says cannot automatically merge. The reason for this is it's usually either because you didn't do git pull, or because while you were coding, someone else on your team changed the exact same lines of code that you were working on. So it's actually not a big deal if, let's say that Joanne is working on the top half of this nav bar, and then, maybe Scott is working on the bottom half of the nav bar. That's not a problem. It's only a problem if Joanne and Scott both edit, let's say line 23, and they edit it to be different things. And if that happens, it'll just give this error, and then you just follow the prompts on here. This pops up that says resolve conflicts, and then it'll actually show you where the conflict is. So it might say Joanne's changes, and it might say Scott's changes, and then they can choose, they can just delete the ones that they don't want to keep. And then that will enable them to reconcile those differences and commit or merge that code onto GitHub. Okay, now we'll move on to JavaScript. So JavaScript is a scripting language that makes HTML dynamic. Now, what that means is without JavaScript, really all you have is a page, right? So like what you might see on a blog, or it's just a page that doesn't change and that the user can't really interact with, they can just read. It's not the same as Java. Some people get them mixed up, but they're actually completely different languages. I don't know why they both start with Java, but they're not the same at all. And the programs are actually, the code is run by the user's browser. So when you write code on JavaScript, an individual's web browser is actually reading that code and then performing whatever the tasks are. And this is opposed to some more traditional backend work like Python, actual Java, or PHP, where the algorithms and the heavy duty work is actually being done on the server. And when I say server, I'm basically just saying the company's computers, right? So it's JavaScript is actually done on each individual's computer. So if I go to a website, it's my computer that's doing the JavaScript work, whereas these other backend languages are being done on like the supercomputers that a given company that's running the website is actually using. Some very common uses of JavaScript are one, to display or hide HTML content. You could also use it to change HTML content of some sort. If you want to maybe change the wording of something. You could also change CSS formatting. So I could maybe change a button from green to red based on the calculations of JavaScript. You could also use it to react to user inputs. So if, let's say, and I'll actually show you an example of this. Let's say a user is inputting their health information and it reaches a certain threshold, then you can use JavaScript to make a decision of what do you do if you're above or below that threshold. It could also be used to create cookies. So cookies are basically just little snippets that tell the browser things about a given user so that you can do things with it like, oh, this user's been here before. You don't have to show them the tour. Or this user, last time they were here, they really liked the physician finding thing. So make that more prominent, that sort of thing. And then you can also create alerts, which I'll show you how that works in our in-class examples. Another big part about JavaScript is libraries. So with libraries, remember when we talked about the head? So you can actually put different existing libraries that someone else has created into that head, and you can have all of the functions of that. So I'll show you a few of these, but this is the code, and I put it here specifically this way so that you can take this line of code and put it onto your web page if you want to use it. But if I were to, let's say, paste this line of code into the head of my document, I will have all the functions of chart.js, which enables me to make graphs and things. Okay, one thing that's important is that the order of code that you paste when you're installing a library really matters, because a lot of these libraries, as an example, are dependent on jQuery, because jQuery is just a very commonly used framework to make JavaScript a little bit easier to use. And so it's important that JavaScript or the jQuery line be at the top, because the other libraries might actually use the output from this in order to run properly. So there's several different ways that you can put JavaScript into your document. One example is inline. So an example of inline code would be right here, where this is actually an HTML file, and it's got HTML elements and tags and all of that and buttons. And they actually wrote this script tag in order to write JavaScript on that same HTML document. Now, an example of an external file might be here, where I've actually put a line of code that links to another piece of JavaScript that's not an HTML file. It might be this external file.js, and they can use that in order to put a lot of code on just a different file to break that code up a little bit. Using an external file is actually best practice, but what I usually like to do is write the code inline first, and then copy and paste that into an external file. And we can walk through that in the code examples. So what's an algorithm? Here, I displayed it as that traditional black box algorithm, because essentially what you're doing is you're taking inputs, and if you're the user, you're putting those inputs in. The algorithm is doing something that you actually, as a user, don't have a lot of visibility to, but of course, you all, as the developers, created these algorithms. And then you use those algorithms to turn those inputs into outputs that might be useful. So you might take things like glucose readings or heart rate, maybe location, and then turn that into diabetes diagnoses or suggestions, maybe hypertension results, or if it's location, doctors near you. So things like glucose level, heart rate, location might be your inputs, then your outputs might be glucose diagnosis, heart rate trending or tracking, or maybe a graph, or doctors near the user. So algorithms are not just coding things. Algorithms can absolutely just be a thought process or a decision tree within, let's say, medicine. So I think a great way to show an algorithm is just as a decision tree. If any doctor is confronted with a diabetes patient, they're going to be doing algorithms in their head to figure out, is this person actually diabetic? Or maybe they're pre-diabetic, or maybe they're severely diabetic and need to go to have some sort of operation right away. So here's a decision tree where you're thinking about, okay, what is the plasma glucose level? What is the HbA1c level? If it's high, they definitely have diabetes. If not, maybe I'm going to re-examine them, ask them what their symptoms are. If their symptoms happen to meet diabetes, then yes, they are diabetic. If not, maybe they're just suspected diabetic, in which case I'll revisit them in 3 to 6 months. So this is the process that a doctor might go through that way back in the day was just something that you were taught and you had to know, and you maybe had to memorize thousands of these different diagnostic algorithms to understand with a given patient what might be ailing them. With computing, you can now write these algorithms so that that thought process is not subject to the whims or learnings of a given doctor, but instead can be automated so that that doctor can maybe start to be thinking on a higher level, right? Maybe the algorithm that's in a software program can give them the basics of, well, this person's probably diabetic because of A, B, and C. And then they can just start thinking about, okay, well, what are some of the higher level aspects of this person's life, their behavior, et cetera, to make a more informed decision. Now, I want to walk through a little bit of how we might turn this thought process algorithm into an actual coding algorithm. So in this case, we create anyone want to chip in what a var is in JavaScript?
Is it a variable?
Variable, yeah.
Yes, exactly. And so what am I doing here? When I say var d glucose equals 126, what does that mean?
The D glucose is the variable's name, and then you give it a integer value of 126.
Exactly. So now I've set my d glucose, which might just be shorthand for diagnostic threshold of glucose, to 126. I'm also going to create another variable called DHbA1c. So HbA1c, the hemoglobin levels, are another important marker for diabetes. And I'm going to set that to 48. I'm then going to create 3 more variables: glucose, HbA1c, and symptoms. And now these ones I didn't give a value because they're actually going to be subject to whatever the given patient inputs into my algorithm. So I'm going to now start to set rules. In this case, my first rule is going to be if both glucose and HbA1c exceed the thresholds, alert the patient that they have diabetes. And this is just using JavaScript syntax to create this language into a piece of code. So it says, if my patient input glucose is greater than my D glucose, which was the threshold that I set, and my patient input HbA1c is greater than my diagnostic threshold, then send an alert that says you have diabetes. Any questions on how that works? Seeing a few more blank stares. Anyone want some clarification on this? Or maybe someone could guide me. What might be an example of patient inputs that would give me the alert, you have diabetes? Just throw out some numbers, like a combination of numbers that would lead to this alert popping up.
So you're saying that the thresholds are 126 and 48, right? So if the D-glucose is like maybe 150, then it can alert the patient, or does it have to be both of them?
In this case, because I put and, it would have to be both. So in this case, what it's saying is if my glucose is over 126, so let's say 130, and my HbA1c is over 48, let's say 50, then I'll get this alert. However, if my glucose is, let's say 130, so high enough, but my HbA1c is only 20, then I would not get this alert. Okay. Now, if not, you can ask another question. Does the glucose alone exceed the threshold? So here I'm putting an else. And then so I reach this else if this is not true. So if my patient inputs do not exceed both thresholds, right? And then ask another question. Well, how about just the glucose? Does just the glucose exceed the threshold of 126? So this would be the example, Maria, that you brought up. What if just their glucose reached, let's say 130? Then it's going to ask this question. And if so, let's ask another question, maybe to get a little bit more into detail on the patient. Are they symptomatic? Because remember, I've created this variable of symptoms. So if symptoms exist, then you can send them the alert. You have diabetes. So in this case, patients get the alert, you have diabetes, if either both of their quantitative numbers exceed the threshold, or just the glucose exceeds the threshold, but also they have symptoms. And this, by the way, this matches what we saw here. So the physician's diagnostic criteria is they ask, are they both at the diabetic level? Then they have diabetes. If only it's glucose, then start to look at their symptoms, right? And based on that, you can then make a diagnosis. Okay, so going back. Now, maybe they don't have symptoms, then you can send an alert. So they have high glucose, but no symptoms. Well, please test again in 3 to 6 months. So this is an example of how you might turn the physician's algorithm that they have in their head into something that you can put into software. Any questions about how that might work? There's also the concept of buttons. So I'll just show you an example here of where on my HTML, I have created a button called disease alert. So the button actually says arthritis, but the ID is disease alert. And then I can create JavaScript that does things with that. So in this case, my JavaScript looks for something with the ID disease alert. And are you all familiar at this point with the fact that a hash is for an ID and sort of the dot is for a class? So this is just the syntax that you use to tell JavaScript to look for any element that has the ID disease alert, like this one, and wait for someone to click on it. When they do, you can toggle maybe the arthritis image or the arthritis text to show up. And I can show you how that works in an example. In fact, I'll show you right now. All right, bringing my code down. And then I will open that up. So I've got my Finder, and I'm going to open Index with my Google Chrome. Okay, so this is my sample web page. just to show, or just to verify, I guess, that it is the page. This is the ALS 414 web page. Let's say JavaScript dynamic page. Okay, reload. There, it's in. So I know that these are linked up. I know that my browser and my code are now talking to each other. Let's go over to, how about, let's go to medications. So remember, I made this list a couple lectures back. Let's make these clickable. So Prozac we already made into a link, but how about if we go below that? So I'm going to find my medications. Let's put a button. Let's give it the ID, show, let's say pill, show pill image. Okay. And we can just call it drugs. So I've now created a button beneath my list that's labeled drugs, and the ID is show pill image. All right, there's my button. Let's give that some style. So in addition to this ID, well, actually we don't. Yeah, let's create a class. I like to use IDs mainly for JavaScript, and then the class mainly for CSS. The only thing about ID is it's very important if you give anything an ID that is the only element that you've given that ID to, because JavaScript just needs to know that this is the one and only one ID that we're working with. If you need to give a certain property to multiple different elements, then it's best to have that as a class. So let's call this button example. And so now my CSS, I'm going to create a class called button example. And then let's just give it a background color of green, a border of I think 1px solid black. So now when I did that, I reloaded, and now it's got that styling. I might also want to give it text size of, let's just make it a little bit bigger, 18 pixels. And then how about color? So if it's background color, then that colors the background. If it's just color, it's going to color the text. So let's make that text white. Okay. Oh, I actually messed up. Not text size, font size. I can also do a border radius. Just make those corners a little bit smoother. Okay, so now it's starting to look a little bit more like a button. Let's actually make the border radius even bigger. And here's my button. I could even, if I wanted to give it a longer width, I could do that. Let's give it a set width of 100 pixels. So a lot of times with buttons, you want to have a set width so that all of your buttons look the same. Other times you just want the button to be as small as the text. Okay, so here's my button. When I click it, nothing happens. So I want something to happen. I'm going to create some JavaScript to make sure that that happens. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create my JavaScript inline. So I'm going to look for that ID. And this is the format that I use in jQuery to do so. And I'm going to say click. So at this point, I'm creating a listener called a click listener. And when someone clicks, I want to execute a function. Now, you notice that I put this open and close parentheses here. If I wanted to, I could put a variable within here. We're not going to do that for now, but it's something that I have the option to do. Okay. So we'll just get rid of that for now. We just want to do some sort of function when this is clicked. So the very simplest function I could do is send an alert saying drugs, right? Now when I click the element with the ID show pill image, which is my button, it should perform this function and say drugs. Another sort of annoying thing with JavaScript is you need to have semicolons at the end of your actions. So my actions are this alert and then this function as a whole. So let's reload drugs. It's now created an alert that says drugs. Okay. Any questions about how that works? So I've now used my button to do something. I could even do something fancy with CSS. So how about when I do this, I want to actually turn my medications list to a different color. So when I click, I want to perform this action. I want to grab my class that says text title. And because it is a class, it's going to be a dot instead of a hash. And I actually want to change its property. Okay. And now my property name is going to be color. And I want to change its value to red. You can see that as I'm doing this, there's like a helper that pops up. This is just a Visual Studio Code thing. So I've created my property. And it's saying, oh, this is a method. If I click it, I can now say, what is the name of the property that you're trying to get? And then my second input is the name of the property that you want to set it to. And then there's other different things you can do if you want to get really fancy. The best thing to do, though, if you really want to see how it works, is just Google JavaScript change CSS, property as an example. And then I like this W3 Schools because it's very simple and allows you to play with the code a little bit. And it just tells you a little bit more about how to do it. Okay. So going back, I want to change my color to red. I think this is going to work. Let's see. It didn't quite work. So let's go back into this. They didn't use JavaScript here, so or jQuery. So let's see, jQuery change CSS property. All right, back here. Okay, so they actually here, it's not prop, it's CSS. So that's what I got wrong. Okay, so now I'm going to change the CSS color to red. I think that's going to work. There we go, turned red, right? And it did the alert before it turned red just because I put the alert first. If I were to delete that, put it below, then it's gonna, well, I guess the alert just took precedence. So a lot of coding is just trial and error. You could see that, I didn't get it right the first time. Then I tried to change a few things, still didn't work. Then I Googled it and then finally figured out what to do. I would recommend with JavaScript because it's just a lot easier to use jQuery to when you Google something, say something like jQuery and then whatever you want to do. That way you'll get the answer in jQuery format. If you don't use jQuery and you just use traditional JavaScript, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. I just think that jQuery is a little bit easier to work with. Okay. Any questions about how I use JavaScript to make my button a little bit more dynamic? I could also do something really fancy, right? Let's see, over in the, I think, family page, I created that map image. Why don't we put that over on medications? Or actually, you know what? Let's create a new file. Pill image. So we'll download, oh, this is a big file. Let's do a smaller one. Okay. So I'm going to save this image. I think I'm going to save it. Where to go? Save image as. For some reason, this image does not want to save. But what I can do is just screenshot it. So I've now screenshotted my image. And then I'm going to go to desktop to find my new image called drugs.png. And then I'm going to put that image back into my folder. So in this case, it's my sample project. Remember, I'd created this images folder earlier, last lecture, when I wanted to put some images onto my page. So now I have this drugs.png within images. Okay. So I copied this provider map. I'm going to move that over to above the button. Okay. And then instead of provider map, we're going to turn this into drugs. All right, now the image is here. Let's give it a new class called drugs image. Just to make it a little bit smaller, drugs image. And now we're going to give it a width of, let's say, 200 pixels. Height, we'll make it auto so that it doesn't scrunch up. All right, now it's small. Now, I actually would rather it not be next to each other. So because of that, I am going to put it within a div. Something's within a div element, it means it gets its own line to itself. Okay, so now it's within the div. Now they should stack. Perfect. I don't like that they're flush against each other. So I'm going to add a margin bottom of 12 pixels beneath the image. All right, now there's space, right? Now I can breathe. Last thing I'm going to do is actually change display to none. Now, when I do that, it disappears, right? Why would I want to do that? Well, I want to show you what happens when I give the drugs JavaScript the instructions to make the image appear. So going back to medications, let's take away the alert. I don't really care about that anymore. But now I want to make my drugs image right here. So because it's a class, period, drugs image show. That means that I'm going to turn something that was hidden into something that's visible when I click this button. So in sum, anyone want to volunteer? Based on how I have this written, when I click the drugs button, what's going to happen?
Is it going to show you the picture of the drug?
Yes. And then will it do anything else?
Won't it also change the medications to red?
Exactly. Or at least this text title. So anything with the image text title, it'll turn to red. So it's going to do these two things, line 48 and line 49. First thing it's going to do is change it to red. Next thing it's going to do is going to show whatever class is drugs image, which is really just this image. Okay. Let's see if it works. All right. Right. So I've now done those two things. I could even do, instead of show, something called toggle. If I do toggle, what that means is it shows it if it's hidden and it hides it if it's showing. There we go. Cool. So you can imagine I could have a button maybe that when I click it, it brings up an image that says, congratulations or success, or you found a friend, something like that, you know? You could also make it do more complicated calculations and only give you the success if those calculations sort of meet whatever the success criteria is. Any questions about how that works? So I got this toggle drugs. Okay. Why don't we go to, no, not patients. How about, let's create a new provider. And let's actually call that diabetes. So we can put our diabetes algorithm in. Diabetes. So if I go back to home, now look, I've got this diabetes in the dropdown. What do you think? When I click it, is anything going to happen? So I've written it so that it links to this diabetes.html. What do you think is going to happen when I click this? Anyone?
Should go to that web page, but I don't think we've like created that one yet. But
Exactly. So let's see what happens when I click it. Error, right? So it tried to go to diabetes.html, but I don't have a file. So what I need to do is create one. What I'll do, I think the best way to create a new file for these purposes is just to save as. So I'm going to save my index. And now I'm going to give it a new name called diabetes.html. And then I'm going to make some changes here. So why don't we call this determine if your patient has diabetes. And then we can have here, enter information below. Now let's give it a try. So I've now created my diabetes page. And when I click diabetes, boom. Now I know that when I go there, I go to whatever code I've written into my diabetes.html file. And the reason is because I've created this ahref that links to diabetes.html. So this is something you can easily do with your applications as well. All right, so now is the fun part. We're going to create a form with an algorithm that helps us determine if someone has diabetes, right? Okay, so the first thing I want is, let's create a label. And then we'll give it just the class, a text body, just that it has the same formatting as this enter information below. But if I wanted to, it could be something else. And then this is going to be the glucose level. Okay. Now below label, I want to create an input. And let's give that ID a name called glucose. And then actually, because it's an input, and you remember this from early on when we were doing forms in HTML, giving it a type will tell it what type of input. In this case, we can call it a number. Let's create another one for HbA1c level. We'll give this the ID HbA1c, and that will also be a number. So let's see what happens when I reload. All right, now I've got my glucose level and my HbA1c level. Last thing I want to do is symptoms. So how about, do you have, oops. Do you have symptoms of diabetes? All right, so we'll keep it simple. And then we want to turn this input into a checkbox and give it the ID symptoms. Okay, so this is super simple. You would probably want to do a little bit more finessing if you're doing this for your application, like maybe you list the symptoms, something like that. But we'll just stick with this for now. So we're just asking them, do they have symptoms? We could also change the order, right? So displays symptoms of diabetes. And maybe I put my checkbox on top of it, something like this. So this actually looks a little bit more familiar with how we use our checkboxes. If I want, I could also put a div container around each question if I want them to be stacked. So I have a different div for glucose, a different div for HbA1c, and then I can create one more div for my symptoms. Feel free to interrupt if you have any questions about sort of why am I doing these divs. So I'm doing the divs just so that instead of these all being on the same line, they all have their own line, okay? So I have something that looks a little bit more like a form. I wouldn't say it's a very good looking form, but it's a form. It'll work for now. Last thing I want to do is let's do one more div wrapper, and then we'll give it the a button. We can give it the same class as that other button that we had. What did we call it? Button example. And then we can just label it submit. All right, so now I have the ability to enter information below my glucose value as a number, HbA1c also as a number, and then symptoms as a check. Make sense? Any questions here so far? Okay, so next step is we need to write an algorithm. This is where it gets fancy. So I'm gonna do a script, and now I need to do my variables, right? So I'm doing a commenting out. These double slashes are for commenting. On most computers, it's just command slash, and that automatically comments it. I could also sort of on a line comment it with command slash. It's a nice way to comment out code if you want the code to not do anything, which sometimes you do if you sort of have code that's not ready for prime time yet, but you don't want to lose the code that you wrote. You would just comment that out. But for this, I'm just commenting so that I can write constants. So I'm going to do my constants right now. Variable d glucose, and d glucose is going to equal 126. Variable d HbA1c, and that threshold is going to be 48. I'm going to create another comment called inputs. Now variable glucose is going to equal And now here's my first thing that's going to get really fancy is I want to be able to figure out what the input was that someone put here. So I'm actually going to grab, using jQuery, the ID, so hash for ID for glucose, and that's going to match this. So I'm saying that look at this input. This is what I'm telling jQuery right now, but I haven't told it what to do with this input yet. So now what I'm telling it is I want the value. And this could be obtained if you're not sure what the syntax is, or I haven't told you yet, you would just do this, right? So jQuery, how do I get value of input? And now I like Stack Overflow. I like their format. So I'm gonna click this. And now it says all kinds of different ways. There's a lot of different ways to do it. But here's the way that we did it. So .val. And everyone, they also get a little bit deeper into like, well, this is the way that you get the current value, but if you do it this way, then it returns the value actually from the HTML. So either one works. Okay, so this should actually grab that glucose value. One thing I did forget to do is if I just run this script as is, it's going to run immediately on page load. I don't want it to do that. I want it to run when I click the button. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a click listener using jQuery. I'm just going to say button example. So I'm going to look for a click of that class or anything that has the class button example. And then when I click, I want to execute a function. And then I'm going to put this stuff within that function. Make that look a little neater. Now we're good to go. Let's do an alert just to make sure that we're on the right page. So if I do this, what it's going to do is it's going to create this variable glucose. It's also going to create these, but it's not doing anything with these. It's going to create this variable glucose that comes from the input from that has the ID glucose. So this input, it's going to grab this value, and then it's going to send an alert that contains that value. Let's see if that works. So glucose level 44, HbA1c, let's say 100. Doesn't really matter what I put because I haven't done anything with this on the algorithm. When I click submit, this page says 44. Okay, so it worked. It didn't do anything very useful, but what it did is it took the value from this input, ID equals glucose, found the value, labeled the variable glucose as that value, and then gave an alert of that variable glucose. Okay, that's not really what we want to do. Let's create another variable called HbA1c, and let's make that the same thing. So I'm going to just copy this, but now I need a different ID. So it's going to be this ID. And I want that value too. Okay. Now I want to figure out symptoms. So symptoms is a checkbox, right? It's not a field that I'm entering a value into. So for checkboxes, we actually want to just check if that box is checked. So I'm going to create an if statement that basically asks if that box is checked, then symptoms equals yes. So if I do that jQuery call, actually for a hash, because we're looking for an ID, and we're actually looking for the ID called symptoms. So if symptoms is. And this is just sort of nomenclature for jQuery. You don't have to, again, you don't really have to memorize it. You just have to know that this is the way that it works. And if I were to Google it, right? jQuery, how do I check if checkbox is checked? So I go to Stack Overflow, and then they give me different ways of doing that. Right, so you really just have to copy that. So this was the one that I used. If this variable is checked. Okay. Sometimes you just try different versions and you see which one works for you. A lot of coding is trial and error. So if it's checked, I want my variable called symptoms to equal true. And then otherwise, I want my variable symptoms to equal false. Okay, so now I have figured out how I can get that the user's inputs into my algorithm. So next up, algorithm. Before I move on to the algorithm, does anyone have any questions of what I've done here? Anyone want to tell me what I've done? So what am I have three variables that are important, right? I've got these constants, but they don't change. They're not that fancy. My three variables, glucose, HbA1c, and symptoms. Anyone want to walk through, sort of repeat back to me what I've created and what they're doing, what the different values mean? Maria, I feel like you're about to talk. Sorry, did I interrupt someone?
It's okay. John just unmuted. I was going to do it, but I wanted to see if somebody else said it, but I think John unmuted.
Yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. You're taking the user input for glucose and HbA1c and assigning those to variables in the jQuery script so that we can use them later, assuming for the algorithm. And then same thing for the symptoms, but the symptoms is assigned to the checkbox. So when it's checked, then I guess we'll display the symptoms.
Exactly. So if it's checked, my symptoms are going to equal true. And so I'm going to do some stuff with that. If it's unchecked, then it equals false. Okay. And we can just verify. You know, sometimes it's nice to just verify before I move on to the algorithms. I want to make sure that what I've done with my inputs is actually working. So let's try this out. Oops. So if it's unchecked and I click submit, I've done an alert for that symptoms variable and it says false. So far, so good. If I check it, it says true. Okay. So now I know that my algorithm on the back end is reading this correctly. Now I know that if I mess up, it's going to be my algorithm, not my inputs. It's nice to, when you're doing coding, like sort of treat everything one by one. Make sure that before you move on to that next step, that you've got everything right in the previous step, so that if something goes wrong, you sort of know where it went wrong. Okay. So now with my algorithm, here I'm just honestly blatantly copying from the slides. So I'm going to say if my variable glucose is greater than D-glucose, I am poorly copying from the slides. Glucose, okay, take away that L. And my variable HbA1c, and by the way, capitalization matters, so make sure that you're matching it, and I am, is less than DHbA1c. And I just made it hard on myself by making this one capitalized and this one not, but whatever. As long as I match, I'm good. So if they're both greater than the threshold, I want to create an alert that says you have diabetes. Well, I think we've been talking about this as if it were a doctor. So let's say your patient has diabetes. Let's see if that worked. So my glucose threshold is 126 and my HbA1c is 48. So how about my glucose is 200, HbA1c is 50. I click submit. Oh no, it didn't work. Very common. It almost never works the first time. One thing that I can do is right click my page, view page source. Oops, sorry, wrong one. Inspect. And this is with Chrome. Every browser has their own way. It's something along these lines. It'll usually say inspect when you right click. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And I can go to console and I can see where it goes wrong. So let's just reload again. 250, submit. Oh, it actually didn't give me an error. So here I'm left wondering what happened. When there's no error, it's a little bit harder to debug. I can see right now what I did wrong. Can anyone else see what I did wrong? So the reason it didn't give it an error is it basically just said, okay, well, this is not true. You didn't meet that threshold, even though I thought I did. If I were to create an else, I could do an alert that says your patient does not have diabetes. I'm pretty sure that's going to show up. So let's try that. So glucose level, 200, HbA1c, let's even make that higher, 100, submit. Your patient does not have diabetes. This would be a horrible app because this patient definitely has diabetes. So we need to fix this. Any guesses as to what I did wrong? It was a stupid slap your forehead error. How come I gave this person glucose and HbA1c that far exceeded the thresholds, but it ended up saying your patient does not have diabetes? What did I do wrong here? I'll give you a hint. It's somewhere in here.
Is it one of the less than signs?
Yes, exactly. Which one?
You currently have it like HbA1c is less than DB, the HbA1c, but it should be greater than.
Exactly. So let's push that to greater than. Again, it's always, this is the annoying thing about coding, but it also can be satisfying when you fix it, is that sometimes when you fix it, it's like just one thing. It's like, I just put less than instead of greater than, and then it works. So now let's do that same unhealthy patient, submit. Your patient has diabetes. Great. Okay. Now we actually don't want to end it here. So let's do an else. Instead of else, just go into the alert. Let's say else and then another if statement. So if just glucose is greater than D glucose, then ask another question. So the other question we're going to ask is, do they have symptoms? So if just the glucose is greater than D glucose, then we're going to do another if symptoms, because remember, I gave symptoms a value of true or false. So if you ask JavaScript if false, then it just says, okay, well, that's not true. And then it'll move to the other. But if it's if true, then it'll do whatever's within this bracket. So in this case, if they have symptoms, give the alert, your patient has diabetes. Else, give them the alert. Oh, actually, I think for that diagnostic algorithm, it said, tell patient to revisit in 30 to 60 days, something like that. Okay. Then we can do another else that says, alert, your patient does not have diabetes. Okay. So I finished my algorithm. I can almost guarantee you there's something wrong with this, but we just have to find out what that is by testing it out. So what I'm saying here is basically, if both my glucose and my HbA1c are above my thresholds, then they have diabetes, and we just say your patient has diabetes. If not, if that's not the case, so if they're both not above the threshold, but glucose is above that threshold, then ask another question. Ask if they have symptoms. If they do, then say, yeah, you know what? Because you had glucose, because they had symptoms, your patient probably has diabetes. If not, then say, tell patient to revisit in 30 to 60 days because they do have that high glucose, don't have symptoms yet. So we're not ready to make that call, but they should probably come in for another visit. And then this else is actually saying, okay, so glucose and HbA1c were not above threshold. Glucose alone was not above threshold. So they're in the clear. Just say your patient does not have diabetes. Let's see if it works. So I reloaded, and note that I have my inspect here and I got this red error saying syntax error is missing a close parentheses after the argument list. So before I even started, I know that this is not going to work. Just for kicks, let's try it out. Nothing. Okay. So this is saying that it's in line 78. Oh, what's going on in 78? What did I do wrong? Can anyone tell? It's basically this thing. This is because I was doing a bunch of stuff. I wasn't really paying attention. I ended up creating these extra close brackets. So if I get rid of those closed brackets, it should work out. Sometimes you can't really figure out where the closed brackets are. With Visual Studio Code, I think Sublime Text also does this. You can click on a bracket and then you can see its partner bracket. So this can help you diagnose, are my open and closed brackets in the right spot? It should be good now. I reload, no error. 200, 100, symptoms. Your patient has diabetes. Okay. Stick with the high glucose. Let's lower that HbA1c to a much lower level. They don't have symptoms. Tell patient to revisit in 30 to 60 days, right? So here, high glucose, low HbA1c, no symptoms. That means that I got into this part of the algorithm because they have the high glucose. But then when it said if they have symptoms, that actually turned into false because they didn't check that box. So it took them to this else. Tell patient to revisit in 30 to 60 days. Let's try clicking symptoms. Your patient has diabetes. Now let's try lowering my glucose. How about just a 1? Your patient does not have diabetes. Okay. So that's because this one is false, right? Are glucose and HbA1c over threshold? Definitely false because they're both 1. So it goes to this else. And then it asks, is glucose at least above the threshold? That's also false because glucose is 1 and my threshold is 126. So it goes to this else, which is alert, your patient does not have diabetes. You could also imagine using that same technique that we used on the other page. I think it was the medications page, right? Here, when I click the button, it shows a picture, it changes colors and all that. So I just chose for my diabetes algorithm to make it a pop-up. But if I wanted, I could have something show up here, okay? So let's actually try that, why not? So below my button, I'm going to create another div. And let's actually make this big. So what we'll make it an H2 header with the class. Let's actually give this a new class called diabetes confirmed. Your patient has diabetes. Okay. Create another one. So diabetes, no. Your patient does not have diabetes. And then we can do another one called diabetes, maybe revisit. And then what did I say there? Tell patient to revisit in 30 to 60 days. Okay. So I got to create a new structure for each of these. Diabetes confirmed. And we'll just give it the color of red. And then display equals none, because I don't want it to show up until I've done my algorithm. And maybe diabetes no. We'll make that, actually, let's make it green. And then diabetes revisit. How about we make that text black? I'm just putting a space here just so it looks nice, but you don't need to. Okay, so none of these are going to show up, right? They're invisible, but I'm going to tell my JavaScript to make them visible at the right time. So instead of an alert, if they have diabetes, I actually want to look for a class called diabetes confirmed, and then make it show up. And the same goes for this. Now for this 30 to 60, I actually want to make the revisit one show up. And then for this one, I want diabetes no to show up. So they're invisible until the algorithm makes them show up. Did I get everything right? It looks good. So let's see. Glucose level 200, HbA1c 100, and they have symptoms. Your patient has diabetes. Let's reload. Low levels. Your patient does not have diabetes. About high levels of glucose, and they have symptoms. Your patient has diabetes. High levels of glucose, no symptoms. Tell patient to revisit in 30 to 60 days. Okay. Let's just do one more thing around that. How about we actually make the background color red, and then the color, so that's the text color, we'll make it white, and then border about 2 pixels, black. I guess 2 pixels solid black. And then border radius equals 4 pixels. So I want to make it look a little bit more like a button. So this is similar to my button example styling. Okay, so now it says, looks more like a, I guess, an alert box. Can also do something called adding padding. I want 12 pixels of padding around my text. Can make that even more padding. Okay, so you get the picture, right? It can look a little bit more like an alert box. If I want it to look more like a circle, then I can make this border radius even bigger. 12 pixels. Okay, so it's more rounded corners when I do that. Any questions? That's our algorithm. It's complex. I don't expect you to get any more complex than this, but you can see how if you know what you're doing in the span of about 45 minutes, you can create a algorithm that will make a medical decision, and then will show up in a very visual way for the user. So this is probably a good time to take a break. Why don't we head out until 4 p.m. and then we'll get started again. In the meantime, if anyone has any questions, I'll stick around and help answer any specific questions for your team.
Scott and we didn't like necessarily like pull it before inputting our own information. So there was like some discrepancy, and I fixed it by just like bring ours separately onto like, I guess like my own like local storage place, and then like just copying it and pasting it over. But then I guess now I'm trying to like pull everything just to make sure it's like all updated. But then I guess it's not the same. I don't know.
Would you mind
Okay.
sharing your screen? Is it
Yeah.
in a place where it can be shared?
Let's see. So I tried.
Oh, that looks really nice.
Thank you. So yeah, I tried git pull, but it says it's already up to date.
Okay.
But then when I open this one, it shows up like this.
Okay, so this is index file. And this is, okay. So could you go back to your terminal?
This one?
Yes, and type pwd
PWD.
and enter.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so it should be in the right place. And type git space status. It looks like everything is up to date. That is strange. Could you click on your Finder window with the file, the index.html? Okay. Is it possible that it's about us?
Oh no, I have an about us page, which shows, yeah, this is my about us page, and the index is the home page.
Oh, okay. So there's a lot of information there that for some reason is not showing up.
Yeah.
And it looks like when you, oh yeah, because you did git pull.
This one's fine. Like the about us page is fine, but like the index one didn't like update.
And copy over, yeah.
Yeah.
That's weird that it says that you're caught up. What text editor are you using?
Visual Studio Code.
Okay, try opening that up. And open up the index. And you actually don't do it from that. Close that. Do you know how to open it just from the window? I can show you that.
No.
So you go to the Explorer. Yep, you had that right. Not in there.
No.
That'll work, but there's a better way.
Right.
Go back
Okay,
to the window. Yeah. And then the file. Yeah.
Okay.
So from here, okay, so this is interesting. Open the folder. And you're actually in the right folder, so you don't have to select anything, just click open. Down at the lower right. Yeah. Okay, and now click the index. So does this looks like it does not have the information, correct?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's
so you know this is not up to date. What happens when you click the Git button, the source code on the left, the 3 dots on the left panel?
left panel here.
Actually the far left. And then down, yeah, that one. Okay, so looks like doesn't think that there's any changes. And then the 3 dots on the upper right next to index, next to the header, just a little bit higher and then a little bit to the right.
This one.
Yeah. Okay, and then try pull from this, see if that works. You don't have to do that. Okay, so it looks like for some reason, it thinks you're up to date when you're not. Could you go back to the terminal?
Where is the terminal?
On the left, the command prompt.
Oh, this one. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And then how about type git branch. So it might be because you're on a branch and it actually thinks that your branch is up to date. So you can go back to main by typing git checkout and then main. Okay, now type git pull. Actually, it looks like it already did it.
Yeah, this looks more like it.
So yeah, branches, sometimes if you're on your own branch, it says, well, hey, you're caught up to your branch, but you're not actually caught up to the main line of code. So that should fix that. Let's try opening up index. So that everyone. Okay, so does that look how you want it to?
No, my nav bar is gone.
What?
The navigation bar is not there.
Okay. That's probably just maybe try git pull, just typing it into the command prompt.
Navigation bar isn't on this code either.
Yeah, so it's probably because you now moved on to your branch on your computer, but it's actually not updated.
Okay.
So now, so you get pulled into your branch. You actually want to get pull from main because you're trying to align with what's the latest and greatest with the code.
Okay, so should I always just check git branch before I like git pull then?
Yeah, git branch is a good, I mean, if you're working on your own feature, then you want to stay within that branch because you don't want to mess up what's going on. That being said, your teams are so small that if you just worked from main and you didn't do branches, I think it'd be fine. Really, where you need branches are when you're working on something that conflicts with what another person is doing. And I'll show you all a little bit of what that might look like once I start up again. But so now it's good, right?
Yes.
Okay,
Okay.
great.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions about that? Joanne, is it okay if I include the recording of this conversation on my upload? Okay, great.
That's fine.
So that way you all can sort of see what happened with Joanne's team with the branches and how you can resolve that. Okay. Now, one thing that I'm going to do before I share my screen is I'm going to, well, actually, I might as well just share my screen while I do this. Let's go back to Zoom, share screen. All right, so these are the changes that I made, right? I created this whole diabetes folder. In the index, I just changed this from this is the ALS 414 webpage to this is the dynamic page. So that's just a silly thing. And then I added the diabetes dropdown. Within medication, I created that JavaScript in order to bring up that picture of the drugs when I type the drugs button. And then I also created this photo and I added some formatting for my buttons. Okay, so those are the changes I made. Now, just to make things a little bit difficult for myself, I'm going to go in from GitHub and pretend to be my teammate who actually changed the title to something different, right? So our fantastic team project. So they made this change and I didn't do git pull. So all my changes that I did were not reflected. Or all the changes that they did, that one change, was not reflected in the code base that I was working off of. So very common issue, not a huge deal, but I'll show you how to fix it. So I'm just going to add these files. So these are the files that I changed. I'm clicking this plus button to stage them. I want to add the image as well. And my CSS changes. So I'm gonna, now that I've staged the changes that I want to make, I click this checkbox and say created diabetes algorithm. What else did I do? Drug button CSS styling changes. Okay, so now I've labeled my commit and I'm good to push. Uh-oh, there's an error. So let's see what happened here. I'm going to go to my terminal and try to do it from here. Hit push, and it says rejected. Failed to push onto your GitHub. And this is because the remote, so this is sort of the GitHub repository, contains work that you do not have locally. This is usually caused by another repository pushing onto the same ref. You may want to first integrate the remote changes, e.g. git pull, before pushing again. Okay. Joanne, is this similar to the problem that you all had?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so there is a way around this. Usually what I like to do is create a branch. So I'm going to say git checkout, and this is how you create a branch, -b. Well, first, let's just see what branches exist. Okay, so I have a couple branches, main, and then some other branches that I created earlier. I'm just going to create a new one. The way that you create a new branch or move to a different branch is git checkout. It's a new branch, I do -b. And then I'm going to create my branch called algorithm. So I now have switched to a new branch called algorithm. Let's try pushing it now. It says, oops, actually you can't do it. You have to use this code instead. So I'm just going to copy and paste it in. This is all this is doing is it's telling GitHub that, hey, I'm not trying to push this to main. Don't worry. I know they're different. I'm not going to screw it up. I just want to push my branch onto GitHub. So I'm going to do that. So that was successful. Now let's see what my GitHub looks like. It says algorithm branch had recent pushes less than a minute ago. Compare and pull request. So I'm going to do that. And it gives me this error, cannot automatically merge. don't worry, you can still create the pull request. So for creating the pull request, this is just basically what's letting everyone know what I did. So if I want to put more details in there, I can. I'm not going to do it for now just to save time, but I'm going to now create that pull request. It's giving me this warning saying it hasn't yet been deployed. And the reason is because this branch has conflicts that must be resolved. So I'm now going to resolve those conflicts. So I go in and I can see that actually my algorithm branch in the index, it said, this is our ALS 414 JavaScript dynamic page. That was what I did way at the beginning of the lecture. And then the conflict is that actually before, I did this git pull, or after I did the git pull, someone had gone in and changed this to our fantastic team project. So GitHub alone doesn't know who's right. It doesn't know whether to listen to me or listen to whoever the other person was that made the change. So we have to now decide as a team what we're going to keep. So in my case, I actually kind of like this fantastic team project better. So I'm just going to delete the stuff from algorithm. I'll delete that too. So just make the code look the way that I want it to look. All right, that looks great. Mark is resolved, and then I can commit the merge. Ooh, page is out of date. What does that mean? Let's try that one more time. Okay, I don't know what the heck happened there. Why it suddenly became out of date after 1 minute, but second time is a charm. Now it says there are no more conflicts. You can now merge, and merge is where I take my branch and put it back into main. So I'm going to confirm merge, and now we're good. So let's see what happens when I go to this page. Our fantastic team project. So that's the one we kept. And then medications. Uh-oh. I think actually, this is why it's actually better to not work with branches as much as possible with your small teams. But I think what happened is because I chose that other person's change, it just kept their whole branch. Yeah, so it accepted actually the other person's changes and it rejected my changes. Oops, I probably should have just accepted my changes. So it's just a good learning moment for how you can make sure that you don't do what I just did. Make sure you accept the changes from the code that I guess you want to keep. Okay, I'm sure there's a way to restore it. What I can do is I'll fix it outside of this lecture and I'll show you how I did it. But if you have any issues like that, just let me know right away and I'm happy to jump in and help out.
But that only happened because they were working on the same HTML file, right? Like you can work on independent HTML files and that won't happen.
Exactly. If you don't work on the same file, then it's not going to be an issue. Okay, it'll never do that complex thing and you won't have to choose which code you want to keep. Okay, but I'll figure out a way to fix that and I'll send you all a video of how that worked. Let's go back into the lecture. It's actually not too much lecture left. I want to just focus on this coding stuff. There's other things you can do with the buttons. You can make them pop up little modals, which is just another word for a pop-up that might be a form or a congratulations sign or something like that. So I put this link here and I'll share the slides with you. You can learn more about how to do that. There's also button links as well as animations that you can do with your buttons. So JavaScript libraries, this was something that I referred to a few slides back right here. These are all very cool ways to do fancy things with your page. So I could implement translation. I know that was something that I think Joanne mentioned for her page. Maps, which is something that I think is relevant for Medrone and Dispatch. Parsley is like a smart way to do forms. There's a lot of interesting libraries here that you can work with. And I also included links here that show very simple getting started things that you can do with these pages. Now, is there anything that you all would like me to go through right now, how to implement, like translate or maps or something like that? Take any takers. Maria, you said something, but I didn't hear.
I said maps, maybe.
All right, let's do maps. So if you remember, on my project last week, I created, I think it was family. So on this family page, I'd done this map, but it's just a picture. It doesn't do anything. So let's figure out how to put a map onto the page. If you click this link, then it gives you a quick how-to. They're doing this with WordPress, but it's the same principle of how you do it. There is a Google Maps API. Now, it's something you have to sign up for, but it's completely free for your purposes for sure. I mean, it's like hundreds of thousands that require you to pay money in terms of users. And unless you all are really good with these prototypes, I don't think you'll have 100,000 users. And if you do, you might want to pay Google anyway, because that means you probably have something valuable in your hands. So this is how you sign up for your API. The only thing is you need to sign up in order to get this API key from Google. I'll leave it to you on how to do this because I don't want to spend time creating an API account on the lecture, but this is pretty good and it walks you through how to do that. Instead, I'll show you the alternate method, which is a little bit easier. So how to add a Google Maps in WordPress without a plugin. All you have to do actually is find a Google map that you want to use. And let's say Huntington Hospital. So I've searched here. And now I can actually share this. Click embed a map. Copy the HTML. And then replace this with that HTML that I copied. So this is called an iframe. Now let's see what happens when I reload my page. All right, now it's not an image, it's an actual map. And because I shared it after I had searched Huntington Hospital, it zeroed in on that Huntington Hospital. There's other things that I could do with this as well. So if I click on the menu, I can click on your places. And then this is all the places I've labeled, saved, visited. I can also create maps. And now I had created this diabetes community centers, which is basically a list of all community centers with diabetes. Might be something valuable to put on a web page. So why don't we do that? So I now have my map. I'm actually going to have to open it in my maps so that I can share it. Click share, embed on my site, and it gives me the code for this specific map that I've made very specific to diabetes and community centers in Los Angeles. Go back to my code and replace that iframe with my new one. And now when I reload, oops, why didn't that work? Let's try one more time. Share, embed. Must not have copied it. Okay, so copy now. Okay, this looks like the right one now. And now when I reload, it's these diabetes and community centers. Okay, so I could put whatever icons I want, whether those be doctors who have drone delivery options or doctors who are available for dispatch and transportation assistance to their practices, something like that. I could put those onto this map for use. I can also, now that I've got it linked up, I can make all sorts of changes to this because the My Maps feature of Google actually allows you to do a lot of different things. So these are just details. I could also, I don't want to get too into it, but there are ways that I can, I think, change the format and all of that. But I encourage you to just to play around with My Maps to see how to do that the way that you want it to look on your specific map. Okay. I can also change how the map looks. All right. So I think, let's find out. I think I can change my width to 100% instead of a number. Okay, so now that it's 100%, it will shrink with my screen, right? So now it's responsive. If I want to make it taller, I could turn that 480 into 1000. And now I've just got a really big map. Alternatively, I could make it much smaller. Now I have a tiny map that's actually kind of useless. Okay. So I can change the look and feel of that map as I want. Does that help? Okay, so Medrone, does that give you some ideas on how you can make your web page a little bit more dynamic? And how about Dispatch? How do you all feel? Will this accomplish a lot of what you need in terms of maps, or do you all have any questions about how to make that even better?
I think that helps a lot. Yeah, we put the image in and that worked out well, but this will add a lot for us.
Cool. All right, so that's maps. What else? Can walk through whatever libraries you want me to walk through. Or I'll just pick some. Go ahead.
Is Parsley like a fill in the blank and then submit, like a form?
Yeah, it's like a form. Now, it's actually more like form validation. So you can already use just the HTML forms that you learned about in Codecademy to do most of what you need to do. But what Parsley will do is it will help make sure that if someone enters the wrong material for some reason, that it catches them on it, right? So let's say that you don't want to make sure that people don't put like their phone number into the namespace, then Parsley will help you do that. And you can see that it has these documents where you can very simply get started. So in this case, as long as you add the references for Parsley, then you name your form, data Parsley validate, you've already started. Okay, so that can really help you get started with doing certain fancy things with your form. One thing that I would add with Parsley is in their documentation, they are telling you to just have your source as the file. That requires you to actually download the file and put it into your repository. Alternatively, I believe I also gave you an example where you can link directly to Parsley's file on the internet. So you don't have to download anything. So either way works. Generally, if you're working on something that like a product that's being used by users, you want to download your own code and put it on there. But for your purposes, I think just because it's simpler, you can just link to the online version. Because the downsides of doing that aren't really going to show up for your purposes. One other thing that I'll bring up, just from the standpoint of JavaScript, is I've kind of gotten a little messy here by putting this JavaScript in line with the HTML. One thing I want to do is create a separate HTML file. So in this case, I'll put it in source. So I'm going to, I'll just create a new file. I'm going to save it as scripts. Although it doesn't really matter what I name it. The only thing that matters is that I'm calling it .js. I'm going to save it in the source file. So now I have this scripts file where I can put all of my JavaScript code. And I'm actually just going to copy this stuff into my scripts file. I'm just going to, if I do Shift Tab, it sort of brings everything back, and then I can just work backwards and make sure that this is formatted properly. But now that I've done this, I do need to create a reference to my JavaScript. So I'm actually going to copy this bootstrap example. I'm going to put it at the bottom. Now, there's multiple places where you could put your JavaScript. You could put it in the head, or you could put it in the body at the bottom. The only reason I put it at the bottom is so that it loads after your main page loads. That's more of just a speed of page load thing. If you put it at the top or the bottom, either way it'll work. But now I'm going to name this src/scripts.js. And that should, actually, I might not need that slash. So I'm just sort of looking similar to what my base was because they're in the same folder. And let's see if that works. Actually, might not work. I might have to do one more thing, but let's just check. Yeah, so it didn't work yet. And the reason is how to link JavaScript to HTML. I actually want to copy what they did here. Let's see if I messed anything up. Actually, I think I did fine. One way to check is I can reload again, view page source, and look for that code. And I can see that it's actually not there. So what did I do wrong? Source/scripts.js. It's right there. Let's just try opening it brand new. src/scripts. For some reason, it's not showing up. Oh, because it's blank. And that must be because I didn't save. Again, a lot of the times it's just the silly things. There we go. Now it works. So I moved my JavaScript code into the scripts file. Let's do the same thing with my diabetes code. Delete all of this. Well, actually, I'm going to copy it and delete it. And I'm going to put it in the scripts file. I could even, if I want, I could like label it and say diabetes algorithm. And this one I can call drug button. I saved it. So now if I go to diabetes, this should work. All right, there we go. So it all worked. I took the JavaScript code out of my page and just gave the page a reference to the file that I just created. Okay. This is, I mean, it's optional if you want to do it. I find that it's a much neater way to handle things. And it helps to make sure that, you know, let's say whomever on your team is working on the JavaScript is definitely not going to do something that interferes with whomever on the team is working on the HTML, right? So it just helps make sure that there's no conflicts in the code that you're writing. Okay, so let's go back to the libraries. Anything else that you all would like to see?
Oh, I had a question on that last thing you went over.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you have multiple buttons like on that page, like how would you differentiate between, I guess, the different buttons if they're on that same script? Like,
So for the pill image one, or the
yeah, or like if you had the button example, right? But there was another button too, and you're just sourcing the same script.
yeah,
But like, how does it know which button goes to which?
yeah,
Like,
it's
but-
a great example, or a great question, I should say. So what I might do is instead of calling this button example, I might call it an ID and call it diabetes algorithm. And then on the diabetes, instead of giving this a class called button example, which I might want to use for other buttons, actually keep it as a button example class, but I give it an ID called diabetes algorithm. And then that way, my JavaScript is actually independent of button example. Now it actually doesn't look at button example at all, just looks at diabetes algorithm. So if I wanted to, I could create another button next to this that says, I don't know, let's call it back, right? And then we can actually make this ahref into our index.html. Take away that ID. Now we're going to have two buttons that are called button example, but only the submit has the ID. So let's see what happens when I click back. So 200, 100. If it were attached, it would give me that red alert, right? When I click back, but instead, it's actually just going to go back to the home page. But then
thank you.
if I do submit, which has the diabetes algorithm ID, it'll give me that, right? Or whatever else I asked it to do. Okay.
Thank
Make
you.
sure that it still works. Yeah.
Professor, can we
Yes.
go over the translation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Okay, so I linked you to this W3 Schools page where it says how to do Google Translate. So learn how to do this. Start with a simple basic web page. Add a div element with the ID Google Translate element. So let's just copy what they did there. And then, well, first let's pick a page. Which page do we want to do this in? Ideally a page with a lot of words, which honestly, I haven't done a lot of those pages. How about the About Us? So now I'm going to look for my About Us page. And I'm going to create or paste that Google Translate element. So now I have a div with the ID Google Translate element right here, right below the We Are New Coders Building Our First Prototype. I reload and nothing showed up. And that's because I haven't done the rest of the job. So what we need to do is look at their example. And in their case, they actually have this piece of JavaScript, which is very important. Oh, I'm on the wrong page. I was like, this doesn't look right. Okay. Add a reference to the Translate API at google.com. So this is the script to Google's translator. And I put this, by the way, on that slide that you saw earlier. So let's put this in the head. Okay, so I just copied and pasted it. This actually, for some reason, the example that they gave, it didn't have the HTTPS. So just add that back in. Otherwise, I'm pretty sure it would fail. And then you need to add a JavaScript function as well. I'm just going to copy that JavaScript function. And we'll put this one at the bottom. And you can see that it's actually calling a function. So it's getting this library from Google, translate.google.com. And now this function that it's calling is just a function that's within that Google library. So if you call this Google Translate element, it's going to make a Google Translate element appear onto the page. So it should work now because I've gotten my library and then I've also used this code that I've copied from W3 Schools. Let's see. All right, there we go. Now I've got my element. I can change that to what language do you want, Joanne?
Spanish.
Spanish? Okay. There we go. So it worked. Changed all of the words on my web page to Spanish. Then I can click Show Original in order to get that back to where it was. So a lot of these libraries, they're super simple. It's really just plug and play. And now that you know how to do this, you're actually basically doing APIs. So I don't know if you all have heard that term API, but it's generally like even a lot of experienced coders, they don't know how to use APIs because they're a relatively new phenomenon. But now that you know how to use it, that's going to empower you to be able to take advantage of all the development work that a company like Google has done in order to add that functionality to your web page. So it's really a powerful skill to have. And by learning this from day one, I think it gives you an advantage over potentially a lot of other coders. There is another element to this. Okay, so you can also change the format. If you notice, the way that they did this is actually by, it looks like it's the same thing, but they put this inline layout simple. I think that's the main difference between what I had pasted and what they've got now, right? So you can see that they're pretty much similar, except this has added this layout function. This is what a lot of coding is. It's just looking at what they did and sort of what they did differently that might have made their code look the way that you would like yours to look. And you just figure out what that is, And then again, sort of trial and error, see if it works for you. So I reload, and now that powered by Google has disappeared, and it's a little bit simpler, right? I could do characters, all kinds of characters. You know, if I want to do Icelandic or just go back to English, I can do that. And then once I've got this, I can change this like vertical or horizontal or simple. Okay. And the only reason I knew those is from this, right? So see here, vertical is actually their standard. Here you can see that they added this horizontal. And then here they added simple. Any questions about that?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Now, just one word of caution. If you put this div Google Translate element onto your, let's say your index page, it's actually not going to work. My index in my case is actually my home page. So you can see that it didn't show up. And the reason is because my home page, I actually haven't imported that Google Translate stuff. So in order to do that, I would actually have to paste that script into the head. And then that function at the end. Now it shows up, okay? You can see that it shows up in this weird place. If I want it to be within the container, then all I have to do is take that Google Translate element and put it within the container. And now it's going to be within the container, okay? Could also put in the nav bar probably. Let's try that. So I might actually give it a bullet. Put it within that bullet. Let's see what that looks like. There. Now it's in my nav bar. I can also put it outside of the bullets. Yeah, so looks similar. I might want to, you know, style this a little bit, which I think I can do. Sometimes with these Google things you can't, but it's worth a shot. Actually, what I would probably do is create another, maybe like a span around it. The reason I choose a span instead of a div is that a span is just less inherently obtrusive. A div always wants to be on its own line. Span just will be wherever you put it. Maybe I want to give it a class called translate navbar, something like that. And then in my CSS, just do my translate navbar class. And then how about margin top 12 pixels? I don't really like that it's up against the screen. I don't think that worked. Translate navbar. Yeah, sometimes with these sort of like Google JavaScript things, they don't always do what you want them to do. But it is what it is. It's not the end of the world if you don't have it formatted perfect. Oh, there we go. Actually, problem was that I tried to create that whole span thing, and it turns out that if I just add that class to the Google Translate element, then it'll reflect it. So let's actually give it a little bit more margin. How about 20? Now it's a little bit more even. Let's go a little bit more. There. Now it looks nice. Okay. Okay, what I'd like to do then, first I'll just explain the next assignment. Very simple. Just finish up your JavaScript lessons on Codecademy. And then I'd like you to complete your user testing with 5 different users. And then I'd expect you to fill out that Word document that I put in all of your team folders, just with the learnings that you had from your testing with those users. In the meantime, what I want to do now is split you up into your teams so that I can sort of navigate between you all. You can talk amongst each other and talk about what are the areas that you want to work on. What do you think the bigger struggles are that you're facing? And then I can just hop between the different groups and answer any questions that you might have. And then next week's lecture, we'll actually have more of that time, just because at that point it gets to a little bit of crunch time, and I want to make sure that you have as much face-to-face time with me as possible as a team.
Things that we have.
Yeah, that makes sense.
How are you all doing? Anything?
We're doing
Good.
well. How you doing, Professor?
Hey, this looks nice.
Thanks.
This is our home page right now.
Um,
We're trying to be able to convert it into an iPhone format, and that's been something that Alana's been playing with, and she's been doing.
yeah, so I tried, I don't know why this keeps showing up so thick. It wasn't like this when I first changed it into like an iPhone format. I don't know if there's a way to fix that. But I think I made the mistake of formatting this in more so like a desktop format and then changing it into an iPhone, which didn't work as well as I expected.
And it's a good exercise to try to go through figuring out how to do that conversion. And I would say that there's a term, and I've faced this myself a lot, where it's, are you programming mobile first or desktop first? And there's always a temptation, because when you're programming, you're on the big screen, to do desktop first. And I think that the solution is just to try to keep it, keep that ugly inspect element panel on the right open at all times, so that you just never really even see what it'll look like on desktop.
Yeah.
And that's really the best way.
Yeah.
In terms of the nav bar, I would encourage you to look up Bootstrap collapse on mobile, and then that should give you your answer. But if you have any other questions around that as you're looking, feel free to ask.
Okay. Bootstrap collapse. Okay.
Collapse. Okay.
Cool. So we're gonna input the
Sorry, Bootstrap collapse nav bar. Make sure
Okay.
you get that nav bar in.
nav bar. Okay.
Okay.
Cool. So okay. So we basically just have like our home, about us, and then our drivers and my account, and then we're gonna input that map like you were talking about. And so what I was more so thinking, like for an iPhone, you would sign in and then you would have just a blank map, and then you would either click like you want to search for a medical site or healthcare professional. So if you click like medical site, it kind of takes you to like, we just had like a picture with like the star would be where you're located, and then we just put in like cars as the boxes. And then I guess normally the way I was picturing it is like you would click on one of the locations, but since this was a picture, couldn't really do that. So I just put in like a table to represent like the different locations, and then you could click that to start the matching process, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I don't know why this page and my other page for the healthcare providers, there's like this huge space, and so, like some of the spacing is weird, and I don't know how to fix it.
Yeah, it wasn't reflected in our code either.
It might have. What do you mean reflected in your code?
Like our code didn't have spaces in between.
Gotcha. It might have something to do with your CSS.
Okay.
So I would encourage you to look at, in this case, and I'm just looking, it looks like you have, and I'm looking at the your panel on the right. It looks like if you hover over container and hover over the one below it, container below.
Oh, this one?
Yeah. Okay. So you can see here, and this is just sort of a trick with the Google Inspect console, is that they give you the ability to sort of see what's going on, right? What's leading to the spaces. And here you can see that the container itself is the orange thing. So the container is providing a little bit of a space, but probably not the space you're talking about, right? You're talking about what's blue.
Right.
So open up that container. You can see the right arrow. Yeah. And looks like you have another container.
Oh.
Yeah, right there. Above the table.
Oh, here.
Okay, so that might be your problem, that you just have these containers.
Mm.
So I would advise maybe to try to get rid of that class.
Can you
The other
delete
ones
it?
seem to be doing their job well, but that one doesn't seem to need to be there. So maybe try getting rid of that third container.
Can you
That
delete it from here or?
no,
Um,
you would have to go into your code, so you'd have to find it again. But this is just a nice way you can use this to like really see what's going on. And you can see that each container, if you look below on styles,
mhm,
it actually tells you what the style is that you wrote for that container.
mhm.
You can see that you've got sort of padding and margins and all that.
Okay.
And in this case, I can see that container down below in styles has a margin of 48 pixels by 12 pixels. So when there's only two values listed, it means that the first one is top down, so the margin on the top and the bottom. And the second one is left right. And so it looks like you have 48 pixels that are creating all this space above. So you could probably either change that 48 pixels somewhere in your code, probably in your CSS, or you could just remove that third container element that you have above the table. Either one would probably work.
Okay, got it. Okay, cool. So then we just have like an about us page. We just put our pictures and then just put a quick description. We'll probably just add some more tabs, like just about like our services or something else. And then drivers, we were gonna put pictures in here, but just like list some of the
Yeah.
drivers.
Mhm.
And then my account, we're gonna have options for insurance accommodations and settings. But we have to make those pages. It's just the account for now. But
Great.
yeah, that's kind of just our overview.
I can definitely see a world in which you have all these great features. And I would say ones to focus on might be, it looks like with insurance or settings or accommodations, there might be an opportunity for a form. So something that might look similar to what I just did with diabetes, where they would just enter values and then you spit something out like submitted or something like that. And then for the driver section, or not the driver section, the homepage, don't I would just advise don't get too caught up in trying to make the map fancy. You'll have an embedded map, so that'll be cool. But there's only so much you can do with an embedded map because ultimately Google owns it. So I would encourage you to focus a little bit more on the things that are around the map. So maybe there's a button for me to call a driver. And then when I click that, it'll tell me something about the driver, right? Or maybe it'll tell me how long it'll take them to get here, whatever you think might be relevant for your particular application. So I would say it's cool that the map's there because that's really the attention grabber for someone who might be looking at your prototype. But within the realm of what you can do, it's probably going to be more the supporting functions.
Okay, got it.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Great.
We have a couple also interviews and user testing tonight. And
Awesome.
then we also are planning on doing them for the rest of the week as well.
Cool. Well, I think the design looks great. And I think you're in a good position where now you just have to add a few JavaScript elements and you'll have a fully functional prototype. I'm curious, since I've got you all in the room, I know that Git was probably tough, but like, is there anything else that sort of like continues to grind your gears or something that maybe there's a better way or you wish there was a better way?
I would say honestly, yeah, the Git was really hard for us to be able to do. I mean, Alana tried sharing her code, I tried sharing mine, and it just kind of got really confusing. When it was updating, it wasn't updating to the right file. When I tried updating it, it wasn't updating to hers. So what we ended up doing is it actually worked really well because I'm able to like annotate screens.
Okay.
So when she was kind of showing me her her specific code, I was like, okay, why don't you go add something here? And oh, you had to be able to put a backslash here.
Gotcha.
That was the way that we collaborated, but I still don't have access to the code. So if I'm going to be able to run user testing, I'll need Alana to be able to share screen.
Okay. I think it might make sense for us to stay after a little bit, or we can figure out an office hours tomorrow where I can try to work with you to get you access to that code.
Sure. I have a meeting after this, but
Okay.
what time are your office hours tomorrow, Professor?
I don't really have office hours. Just send me an email
Okay.
and let's try to figure out a time that'll work for both of us.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Thanks. Good job so far.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Danny or no?
Hey, how
Yeah, I just haven't implemented it into the navbar.
Okay.
Hey, Professor, I have a quick question.
Yes.
So a friend of mine helped me find some widgets that I kind of wanted to implement into our website. I think I'm just having difficulty linking the CSS file to the HTML. I
Sure.
could just show you. So essentially, it's supposed to look like this, where we can just click on a date and it'll populate right there.
Yeah, that's nice.
Yeah, and then so it provides us the HTML code down here, and then the CSS code is right here. And so then I created a CSS file and put the code in there, and I have the HTML code in a separate HTML file. So I'm just not sure like where I would need to implement like the link and then href to the style sheet or whatnot.
Okay, so this is could you make that your VS Code a little bit bigger?
Yeah, sure.
I'm having a hard time reading it because it's so small.
Is that better?
Not really, but I think we can make this work. Okay, so what you need is, do you have your head?
I don't. I knew I had to input that. It's just I'm not sure if I needed to include like the rest of the code within that head or not.
I would just whatever information you have in your index head, put the same information on this code sample head. So
Okay.
you can go over an index. And now just copy that and just put the same exact thing.
Okay, got it. At the top?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and now do you see that there's like a link to the CSS style sheet?
Yeah. So
CSS?
I would just adjust that.
Yeah, make that whatever it is that you want it to link to. And if you want to do both, which you might want to do, you could just copy that line and then create another line and then have that link to base.css.
Okay.
Okay, so that should at least link to it. And then whether the CSS works or not is another story.
Okay. Let me try opening it up and see if it will. No, so like the rest of it doesn't populate up, or at least that button.
So how does the button work? Is it only CSS?
The button I believe is just purely HTML.
Okay.
Is it? Yeah, and then the CSS just, I guess, adds like the styling for it.
Uh-huh. Okay. And then let me see the HTML example.
Okay.
that they give. Okay, so
It's pretty long.
input. Okay, and then you basically copied that word for word, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And then there's all this stuff. It might need to be within a body.
Okay. So
So underneath head, right body.
okay.
No, sorry, outside of the closing of the head. So line 11.
Okay.
And then
so
put your
put
code
this-
inside that.
Okay. This massive thing. Can I just put the ending body at the
Yeah.
bottom?
Yeah, that should work. Now, I will say that one thing that is, oh, actually, this should be fine. Yeah, I think this will work.
Okay.
Okay, now save it.
Save and
This is always this is why I actually don't mind plagiarism. Is
Okay.
because it doesn't make it any easier.
Yeah.
You're just
Sorry,
gonna have to
I just
figure
wanted to
out-
see.
Yeah, you'll have to figure out what
Okay.
what doesn't work within that. And I'm happy to help if you sort of maybe dive a little deeper into what might be missing.
Mhm.
There's probably just some element that they've got in there that you're not missing. Try it on this page, just right click the browser and then view page source.
Oh, page source, sorry.
Okay, now you can see there's a style sheet to the code picker.
Are you referencing right here?
Yeah, click the link. Okay, so it looks okay. Keep going, keep going, keep going. Keep going. Okay, you might want to just check to make sure that the formatting of your CSS looks exactly like the CSS that they have in the example. There's a few minor indent issues that might be the reason.
Okay.
So that's also whenever you copy and paste code, almost always the indents end up screwed up. And so what you might have to do is just sort of what I'll do when that happens is I'll like, if you go to the top, click on right to the left of the margin top, and this isn't gonna work on this because it's just a page, it's not editable, but you would backspace until the margin top is moved to the previous line and then push enter. And then when it pushes enter, it'll know how to indent it, if that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Got it.
So that might be one way, and it's kind of annoying with all this code. I'll show you another way to do it. Is it just the date picker that needs to show up?
For the most part, yeah.
So let me try something out. Share my screen. Okay. Can you see my code?
Yeah.
This might work. I'm just going to create a div so it's on its own line. Input type equals date. back, index. Okay. Yeah. So here with one line of code, just this input type equals date, I was able to create a date picker. Now it doesn't work with Safari, just so you know, but it does work with like Chrome and Firefox.
Okay.
And then if you want to get the value of that, you know, you would give it some sort of oh, sorry, you couldn't see the screen, could you?
No.
We only see your style code.
All right, here we go. So this is my
okay.
index. So, you know, putting more info here eventually, and then my div, and then my input, this type equals date. Now I have a date picker.
Oh, okay. That's way more simpler.
That's
Yeah,
what
I'm
we-
not sure why they went through all that effort with all those lines of code.
Yeah.
It can be done in one line of code. It's possible that their date picker does something special, which might be worth trying to at least figure out how that thing that they did special works so that you can copy it. But I could put something like, you know, input date or whatever I want to call my ID. And then with JavaScript, when someone picks a date and I try to grab that value, it'll say like April 22nd. And then I could maybe do something with that in JavaScript, you know, like maybe someone
Okay.
puts their birthday, and if like the year is before 1960, then you say, oh, you should get an appointment with, you know, for colonoscopy or something, right? Or like if it's a much younger date, then we'll refer you to our pediatrician, something like that.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Anything else I can help out with?
I think Michael and I just had questions about styling, but we can set up an offline call for that.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thanks, team.
Thank you.
You.
Hey, did we lose Scott?
Hi. He never joined us or the breakout room.
Let me leave the breakout rooms or leave yours and then see if,
If he's in the main room.
yeah, you know what? I don't know how to get to the main room. Oh, maybe I just leave. Okay. Okay, I was able to get in the main room. Unfortunately, Scott's not there. Maybe try giving him a call just so you can get aligned. But in the meantime, anything I can help out with? Any questions?
Not at the moment, I guess. Yeah, I guess I'm also just interested in like if we were to like merge it, because that's what I did earlier with Scott's, and then like because I chose his line instead of mine, then it's just like transferred over. I was like, oh no. So
Yeah.
that's why I just copied and pasted all of my stuff into GitHub directly. So yeah.
And that's an option. Honestly, it'll work. It's just sort of the less fancy way to do it, you know. So perfectly legitimate way to do it. I'll try to put that video together of me fixing my error, which sounds like is the same as yours, and then hopefully that's helpful.
Okay, yeah, that'd be great. I guess I just need to look into how to be more responsive, because when I think like it just scrunches up together.
Sure.
So nice.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that counts as a feature. So if you're able to make it responsive, then you can consider that a feature, because that's a lot of work. I know that firsthand. So you can use that as one of the features that you're highlighting. Okay. But I think it looks great so far. So I'm really excited to see what it turns into. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's definitely a lot of copy and pasting, as you said. hopefully
And then like try as
figuring
much
out
as
what
you
you
can
want.
to understand the code that you're copying and pasting and try to put your own little twist on it. I mean, I didn't go to school to code. Everything that I learned was from looking at existing products and making it my own. So that's how most self-taught coders learn.
That's amazing.
All right. I'm gonna visit my last team and then we can wrap up the class.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Nice. Hi, Professor. Alana and I were just popping in here.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it looks like the team grew.
Yeah, well, we hung out with Joanne and then we popped in here, but we'll let you give them some feedback.
Sure.
We're gonna go head out with the med drones.
All right. Yeah, I like this. I like this cross-pollination. You all can share your best practices and
No, it's good. Joanne gave us some good advice. We were talking to her too, and now we'll talk about to med drone.
awesome. Cool. So I'll probably wrap it up in a few minutes after I talk to these guys, and then we'll spend like 1 or 2 minutes as a class, and then we'll close out for the day.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. All right. So what's up? How are you guys doing?
We're good. We're doing well. Um, so we did like start doing our HTML and CSS of our homepage. Did you want to like see like our progress with that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is sort of, this time is for you. So if you want me to take a look and give you all some advice, or if you just have specific questions about things that don't seem to be working, happy to help.
Okay. I can share what it looks like right now. This is pretty much just like what we got so far.
Mhm.
We're still like working on the formatting and all.
I like the pun.
Yeah. So we're like trying to move the title, like we're gonna put it like on the right and make
Sure.
it bigger.
Yeah.
But we have these buttons. They're like a navigation button. They work. There's like, but I haven't worked on the other HTML pages yet.
Mhm.
But these buttons will lead me to the different HTML sites.
Great. Yeah, it looks like those are set up properly. You just need those HTML files.
Yeah, and then these button works as well. It's the same thing. They lead. But like our main focus right now is just like focus on the formatting and then work on the other HTML files. And I was gonna ask, is there a way to like crop on using the codes like pictures? Because this is a placeholder.
Yeah.
For now.
You can crop, but I wouldn't recommend using code to crop. I would recommend just sort of cropping using whatever your native computer photo editing software is. Like
Okay.
I think it'd be Paint if you're using Microsoft, or Preview if you're using a Mac.
Okay, for sure. I guess I'll do that then.
I had a question about the CSS file and whether I need to make one for each HTML page, or if I can have each HTML page reference the same style.css file.
So each HTML page can definitely reference the same CSS file. And in fact, what I would recommend as you create the new HTML files is just copy the entire head of your index.html onto those files, just so that they all say the same thing. In fact, you might want to copy the nav bar as well. Depends on what look you're going for, but if you want that nav bar to be on every page, then I would just, every time you start a new page, just save the index.html as a new named file, right? Like about us or whatever it needs to be. And then just delete everything below the nav bar. The only thing to be aware of when you do that is that when you make changes to the nav bar, maybe on your index, you'd have to make those changes again on the other pages. You don't really have to, it's not a huge deal, but if you wanted the site to like really work the way that users want to use it, then you have to keep updating it. Okay. But the reason I say you don't really have to is like, it's not like once you have the nav bar, I know you know how to do a nav bar. So I think it's more important that you focus on new features as opposed to like the consistency of the nav bar across pages, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
I have another question.
Yeah.
Regarding like the JavaScript, like how much JavaScript coding do you want us to implement into our like websites?
I'd like you to think of at least 2 functions that require JavaScript. So whether that be maybe you click the play button and it does something interesting. Whether that be or here's actually a really good example for you all would be using it to filter.
Mhm.
You know,
Oh,
like
yeah.
I could see a world in which you give all of your like heart surgery podcasts the class heart surgery. And then if someone clicks the heart surgery filter, then it would show all of the heart surgery ones and hide all the others, something like that.
It's a good idea. Okay.
But there's many ways in which you could make it work. I would also encourage you to maybe look at some websites like CodePen or Code Sandbox and just search podcasts. And I'll bet someone has done something interesting that you could then use as a benchmark for your page.
Okay, for sure.
But I definitely want to show that you have some level of mastery over how to use JavaScript on your page. So like for me, design is definitely a plus if your website looks really nice, but I'm more so looking to understand that you know how to use code. So if you have no design sense whatsoever, but you just like show that you knew how to use CSS, and then you showed that you knew how to use JavaScript, then I'd rather you spend all your time on that than how to make the site look like super shiny and all that.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
All right.
All right, I'm gonna end this these breakouts, and then we can come together as a class and then close out the lecture. Okay, so that's it for our lecture today. Thanks so much. I'm really encouraged by what I'm seeing so far. So I think if we keep on this pace, we've got 2 more full weeks before presentations. I think you all are going to do a fantastic job. If you have any questions that you want to chat with me about, feel free to stay on, but anyone else, free to go. Thanks so much for your time.